there really was a worldwide flood, what would the evidence be? Billions of dead things buried in rock layers, laid down the water all over the earth.
Welcome to Creation Foundations, where we discuss the biblical worldview and the value of that worldview. I'm Dick Temple.
I'm Mark Finkbeiner.
And I'm Greg Morgan.
Today we're going to discuss a topic which brought a laugh from a top-level scientist when I told it to him. We're going to discuss what has evolutionism contributed to science. And I'd like to begin with a quote from C.S. Lewis, who had one of the most incisive minds that ever spoke at Oxford. He said, "Men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a legislator. In most modern scientists, this belief has died. It will be interesting to see how long their confidence in uniformity survives it. Two significant developments have already appeared: the hypothesis of a lawless subnature and the surrender of the claim that science is true. We may be living nearer than we suppose to the end of the scientific age." Would you guess when he said that? It was before I went to grade school, 1947. It was before politically correctness was spoken of openly. Back then, Yankee ingenuity was a byword for Americans. Back then, the thought that we would have to be politically correct, or all of us believe the same way, was something that would cause a fight or an impeachment. Yet political correctness had already invaded the world of academia and pseudoscientific research. So what has all this done for science? One thing it has done is change the definition of science. As C.S. Lewis pointed out, they had already surrendered the idea that science is true. No longer was science defined as a search for truth using the tools of observation and logic. Now science is more often defined with the correct definition for naturalism, or trying to limit all evidence to fit into the idea of naturalism. So what has all this contributed to the various fields of science? What has it contributed to medicine, for instance? Mark, could you give us a comment on that?
First of all, I would like to bring up this quote by Michael Egnor. He's a medical doctor and a professor of neurosurgery. And he says, "I work and teach at a medical school. I do brain research, and in 20 years, I have performed over 4,000 brain operations. I never use evolutionary biology in my work. Would I be a better surgeon if I assumed that the brain arose by random events? Of course not. Doctors are detectives. We look for patterns. And in the human body, patterns look very much like they were designed. Doctors know that from the intricate structure of the human brain to the genetic code, our bodies show astonishing evidence of design. That's why most doctors, nearly 2/3 according to national polls, don't believe that human beings arose merely by chance and natural selection. Most doctors don't accept evolutionary biology as an adequate explanation for life. Doctors see firsthand the design of life." I'm going to show where evolution has actually caused science to become dumbed down, that has actually caused science to almost go back into the dark ages. And one of those things was what they practiced in Nazi Germany. They practiced euthanasia. They were practicing medical things on human beings, and they were trying to weed out the weak and kill off the weak and breed a super race. Well, it backfired on him. It didn't work. In fact, the very person who thought that he could create this super race through evolutionary biology, he had his own weaknesses. In fact, he was weak biologically, Adolf Hitler was. He had his own doctor that had to follow him around because he had so many sicknesses. It's just unbelievable to study all of that. And so anyway, one of the things that the Nazis believed in is they believed in this ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny.
Okay, well, what's ontogeny?
Okay, I'm going to explain all that here. What that simply means is that the embryo in a living organism, whether it be an animal or a human being, that embryo goes through the evolutionary stages in the womb. And so I'm going to explain exactly what that means, but I want to talk about Ernest Haeckel here. Ernest Haeckel, he was a guy that came from Germany, and he read The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin, and after reading that, he started to believe in this idea called evolution. And in fact, I want you to understand, Charles Darwin, you will never hear about this in the public school, but Charles Darwin didn't even believe his own theory. That's why when Darwin, when he wrote his book on The Origin of Species, that book sat on the shelf for 20 years. And then another man by the name of Charles Lyell came along and says, hey, you know what? There's some other people who've got similar ideas. You better hurry up and get your book published. Otherwise, you're not going to become rich and famous. So in 1859, Darwin had his book published. But Darwin didn't even believe it himself. But anyway, what you're going to see here is you're going to see some pictures on the screen of a dog embryo at 4 weeks and a human embryo at 4 weeks. You're going to notice that there is a total difference between the dog embryo and the human embryo. Okay? Well, Ernest Haeckel, he comes along and he forges these pictures of human embryos and animal embryos. And you will notice here at the top of this picture, you're going to see where it says Haeckel's drawings on top and then the actual photographs on the bottom. Well, your public school textbooks are going to say that Haeckel, well, he drew these pictures from memory, and so he botched it up a little bit. That they are desperately trying to save this religion of evolution by saying that. Because when you look at these two pictures, you look at the top pictures of Ernest Haeckel's drawings and then the actual photographs on the bottom, you can see there's a huge difference. And the embryos are not alike at all. And so what Ernest was trying to do is he was trying to show that you can actually see so many similarities between the human embryo and an animal embryo that certainly evolution must have occurred. Which of course now we know that was a total lie. Okay? And so here is Ernest Haeckel's confession. See, he was tried for this and he was found guilty at the University of Jena. And when he was convicted, this is what he confessed to. He says, a small percent of my embryonic drawings are forgeries, those namely for which the observed material is so incomplete or insufficient as to fill in and reconstruct the missing links by hypothesis and comparative synthesis. I should feel utterly condemned were it not that hundreds of the best observers and biologists lie under the same charge. Well, I agree with that. He's probably right. In fact, today, these pictures are still in our public school textbooks and they are being taught as fact. But you will never hear about Ernest Haeckel's confession. You will never hear in the science textbooks how this was all forged, that it was a lie. This is a picture that some abortion clinics will show a girl who is considering having an abortion, and she is somewhat skeptical. And so the abortion provider will show her this picture of this baby embryo, and they will say, well, take a look at this. Look at this. You'll notice that there's gill slits at the top of this embryo. And the abortion provider will say, well, see, those are gill slits like a fish. And so your baby inside is basically part fish going through the evolutionary stages, and then the abortion provider will say, well, look at there's the yolk sac like a chicken. And then the abortion provider will say, well, look at this tail here at the bottom. You'll notice that is the tail of a monkey. Well, people, I'm going to tell you something. They should be ashamed of themselves because that is a total lie, because here's what those slits are. Those are not gill slits. Those are what you call throat pouches. That is the development of the thymus gland, the parathyroids, and the development of the middle ear canals. That's what that is. And then the so-called yolk sac, well, that is how the baby gets fed. That is just simply a blood-forming sac where the baby gets its first blood cells. And then the so-called monkey tail. Well, that's not a monkey tail, that's the coccyx. In fact, today you will still hear some evolutionists in the science textbooks say that the tailbone is a vestigial structure. That means it's a throwaway. It's something that you don't really need. Well, I'll take you up on that. Any of you scientists, you evolutionists, that want to believe that the tailbone is a vestigial structure, then come over to my house. I've got a knife. Let's cut it out and see how well you stand after we cut out your tailbone. And we'll see if it's a vestigial structure.
My mother had her tailbone removed to make room for a surgery in that area, and she suffered from the lack of a tailbone. It is a valuable part of the body to which muscles attach.
Yes, right. Yep, and I'm going to talk a little more about that as far as the gallbladder goes. What happens when the gallbladder is taken out? Well, here's a quote from Freud. You remember Sigmund Freud, a very popular psychologist. Here's what he said. Freud relied most heavily in the manuscript is the maximum that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. That is, that the development of the individual recapitulates the evolution of the entire species. I want you to know that Sigmund Freud, his foundation for everything that he taught in psychology was evolution. And so he relied on this idea called ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny in his psychological research. Well, now we're finding out that this is all bad science, and that mainline scientists don't even believe in ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. In fact, I found an article on Wikipedia. You know, that's a very famous encyclopedia, and here's what Wikipedia says. It says, the theory of recapitulation, also called the biogenetic law or embryological parallelism, often expressed in Ernest Haeckel's phrase as ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, is a largely discredited biological hypothesis that is developing from embryo to adult animals go through stages resembling or representing successive stages in the evolution of their remote ancestors. So there you go. There's a secular encyclopedia that says that ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny is bad science. Okay? This comes from the National Geographic. Now, National Geographic is stooped in evolution, and here they're saying this. Appendix, tonsils, various redundant veins, they're all vestigial body parts once considered expendable, if not downright useless. But as technology has advanced, researchers have found that more often than not, I love how they say that because they don't want to humble themselves and just admit that they're wrong about vestigial organs. So they say more often than not, some of these junk parts that they put in quotes are actually hard at work. Oops. Well, there's National Geographic. They're even admitting, okay, these vestigial structures, they're not evolutionary leftovers. Okay, they are very important. But now we know of uses for each one of these vestigial structures. There are no vestigial organs. The appendix is recognized to play an important role in the immune system. That's why when they get their appendix taken out, sometimes they have a lot of problems with their immune system. Now let's talk about the gallbladder here, and then I'll be done. I know a lady who had her gallbladder taken out because the doctor took it out. She was having some problems with it. And ever since then, she has been having problems, you could say some personal problems about going to the bathroom, okay? And my wife, she was having problems with the gallbladder. And so instead, we went to an alternative doctor, a naturopath, because this naturopath did not believe in evolution. This naturopath believed in creation science, okay? Well, guess what? The naturopath gave my wife these natural remedies and saved her gallbladder, which saved her from a lot of problems. See, that's the difference between a doctor that believes in evolution and a doctor that believes in creation. Now I'm going to turn it over to Dick.
Well, I have a few comments on vestigial organs. How do you deal with people who are steeped in evolutionism and things like vestigial organs? I have a daughter that is a very strong, committed Christian. At the moment, she's in Mongolia teaching English. Her teacher started using the textbook and talking about vestigial organs. He mentioned the sinuses. Before my daughter started in public high school, she prayed that she would find grace in the eyes of her teachers. She was very humble in the way she approached them. She asked her teacher, he said, "Sir, do you have a bumper on the front of your car?" And the teacher said, "Well, yes." She says, "What's that used for?" Well, you know, he pointed out the use of a bumper. He says, "You know, my father has sinuses, and you can see a scar right between his eyes where those sinuses protected his brain from the kick of a horse." Now you suddenly realize it had a very important use, but there's another use for the sinuses. The sinuses are the area where air circulates when it's inhaled. It not only warms the air before it goes down into the lungs, it also picks up the impurities that are in the air, various bacteria, microorganisms, and it is the beginning of the presentation of those organisms to the immune system to develop immunity to those organisms that are inhaled. And this is the sort of approach that was used, and frequently the teacher would come back to class after doing some research and tell the class, "You know, what I found out was Crystal was right and the textbook is wrong."
While you were talking, these trees just fell over behind you. This is what happens when you give things enough time, they fall apart. That was evolution right there in progress. You give things enough time and it all falls apart. Time is not our friend, it is our enemy, and there is the proof. Time is the enemy of falsehood.
Not only is time the enemy of falsehood, but the timing of that event was interesting. He's talking about an argument that caused evolution to fall, and the trees fell. I don't think that was coincidence in timing. We had nothing to do with it, but I think the Lord arranged that one. One thing that would be true if phylogeny really did recapitulate ontology is that as those structures develop in the embryo, they would be carried over into the adult human being and result in us having small organs where they think that our distant ancestors had those organs and they were fully functional. Over a long period of evolution, they believe that the function disappeared and most of the organ has disappeared, leaving only a vestige of itself, which is where they get the term vestigial organ. There are things that have only a vestige of their former function and therefore only a vestige of their former size. Scientists over the years, since Darwin, came up with a list of vestigial organs. The total number of vestigial organs was 106. Now, while they were developing those lists, the theologians, at least those who believed in the Bible, were saying, no, all of the organs are useful. God doesn't make junk. And so they said that people would find that those organs do have uses. And now we have people with PhDs who come out and say all vestigial organs have uses. They all are fully functional. Dick mentioned that the appendix has a function. The sinuses have a function. Well, so do the wisdom teeth. It's only in America where you could make an argument that wisdom teeth are vestigial, no longer have a function. As a child grows up and is eating food, the jaws strengthen, they get bigger, and they provide room for the wisdom teeth to grow in. It's only where we've got all this processed food around that the jaw doesn't get big enough to hold the wisdom teeth. In countries where you still have hard food all the time you're growing up, a lot of them also have problems with their teeth falling out, and it's a good thing the wisdom teeth come in later, because now you have teeth that are available for chewing late in life. But all of the so-called vestigial organs have turned out to be functional. That's also found at the cellular level and even in the chemical level of us. Our genetic code is such that it codes for all the proteins necessary to cause us to develop all these organs that we actually have. While they were making these arguments about vestigial organs, they were saying, well, only 2% of the genetic code actually codes for protein. The rest of it is junk, and it's in that 98%, they claim. That's where all the genetic experiments go on, the mutations and the natural selection that result in upward evolution. Well, that's now been falsified. It turns out that they now have discovered functions for 80% of the genetic code. 80% of the genetic code is active either while we're embryos growing in our mother's womb, or are actually active now. One type of genetic system is called pseudogenes. And the Creation Research Society Quarterly has now published an article on pseudogenes, and 80% of the pseudogenes are now known to have functions in the adult. Well, the others, 35% of them were found to have, 35% of the genome was found to have functions during our development as embryos. And then 2% codes for proteins while we're adults. You might notice that's actually more than 100%. Now, I'm not claiming that there's more than 100% of the genome or whatever. What I'm saying is the genetic code is so complex that some sections of it have uses while we're babies, some have functions while we're toddlers, some have functions as adults, and some of them have functions, one function while we're young and another function while we're old. It's an extremely complex system, and there is no room in it for the genetic experiments that would be necessary for evolution. Therefore, there's no room in it for anything that would be vestigial. And to believe otherwise is a matter of faith, not of science. The evidence from even secular scientists is that the genetic code is fully functional, and every single organ in our body is fully functional. Dick mentioned, and Mark mentioned, that the tailbone is useful. Well, it's not only useful for standing, it's where several muscles attach that are essential for a woman who is giving birth. So if you believe in evolution, then they think that we once had a tail much like a monkey's. That means there was no attachment point like the coccyx for all those muscles. In monkeys, they attach completely differently. In humans, they attach the coccyx. Our putative supposed ancestor that's common between the two of us, well, it would have to have the muscles attached in a completely different way than for monkeys or for us. And then the intermediate form, as it became us, it would have to not only change the shape of the tail, it would have to change the location point of every one of those connections. And they would have to work for the intermediate stage, and for the next intermediate stage, and for the next intermediate stage. At what point do you just say, this is laughable? Well, theologians came to that a long time ago. I'm glad to see that some scientists are also coming to believe that. And I'm very pleased to know that doctors who actually watch the function of the genetic code and watch the function of our bodies, they came to that conclusion a long time ago. And yes, the majority of them, as Mark said, don't believe in evolution. So to all the members of the audience, why do you believe in evolution? And while you're thinking over that one, I'll turn it back over to Dick.
Ernst Haeckel fabricated the recapitulation theory, or ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. He did it after he became convinced of evolution, and he did it for a very effective way as far as promoting himself. He had several other methods of promoting himself. One of them was he invented the speechless ape man. Totally invented it. He named it Pithecanthropus alalis. He drew pictures of it, took skeletons around. He actually had no skeletons of a speechless ape man. Speechless ape man never existed. He also invented the Monera, which was supposed to be the first life form that ever existed. He had no evidence for that. Yet he took his recapitulation theory, his Monera, and his speechless ape man story all over Europe, both at the university level, and he was an evangelist for evolution in that he set up meetings complete with, in town halls, complete with skeletons that he brought, pictures of his speechless ape man, there's pictures of the life cycle of the Monera, the whole works. Ernst Haeckel was, by himself, highly effective in producing a belief in evolution in Germany, and as such, getting away from the standards of right and wrong of Christianity, and as such, leading to 2 world wars and the Holocaust. This was the practical results of the work of Ernst Haeckel. Now, Thomas Huxley wanted to go along with this Monera idea. He went out into the Atlantic, dredged up ocean water from very deep in the Atlantic, brought it up, and poured some of this water into a bottle containing alcohol for the purpose of preserving whatever life forms he found, looked at it under the microscope, and he came up with a small, what appeared to him to be an organism, which he called a Monera, and named it Bathybius haeckeli. Well, there happened to be a chemist on board the ship who pointed out that this was nothing more than amorphous gypsum, which was precipitated out of the water by the alcohol. However, that didn't stop the publication of Bathybius haeckeli any more than the fact that Ernst Haeckel was called before his university for having forged the pictures of the embryos. It continued on and on. Actually, when creationists and evolutionists discuss things, the strongest argument creationists have is the rest of the story. What are the other factors that are involved in whatever is being brought forth? Because to back evolution, you have to leave out much of the evidence. Now, what is the actual formation of the embryo morphologically? Actually, Haeckel's idea that he promoted was the embryo first looks like an amoeba, then a fish, then an amphibian, then a reptile. Finally, it starts looking like a mammal, and finally, it starts looking like it's human. Well, that's not what actually happens. You see, nobody ever bothered to publish the various stages of the human embryo from beginning to end and line it up to compare with Haeckel's drawings. He didn't show the rest of the story. When you see the rest of the story, you find that the first thing identifiable about a human embryo is that it has similarities to mammalian embryos. Then it gets more specific as it develops. So morphologically, the embryo first shows the general characteristics of its phylum, then order, then class, then family, then genus, and then finally showing the characteristics of the separate species of humans. A totally different pattern morphologically than what Haeckel came up with. Now, that is on the morphological level. In other words, what we can see. However, on the molecular level, the human fetus or embryo is totally human from beginning to end. This idea of ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny, the recapitulation theory, has resulted in some real tragedies in the United States of America. You see, the United States Supreme Court on Roe versus Wade gave as part of its ruling to legalize abortion the recapitulation theory that the embryo, the fetus, was subhuman. So you see the results of evolution. Evolutionism, the belief in evolution, have been negative throughout. And this is just the beginning of the story. You should hang around to hear the rest of the story.